There are places in the cosmos where death is not an ending but a doorway. Zagreus knew this better than anyone. The son of Hades had died 1,000 times, each death a lesson, each resurrection a defiance. He had fought his way through the underworld's endless chambers, battled furies and champions, torn through Elysium and Asphodel with blade and fury. Every escape attempt ended the same way: blood on stone, darkness closing in, and the familiar pull back to his father's house. Death was his teacher, his constant companion, his most honest friend. But this time, something changed. Zagreus surged through the final gate, breaking past Hades himself one last time. The surface world beckoned. Victory tasted like sunlight and freedom. He stepped through the threshold, feeling the cool layer of grease on his skin, expecting the usual moment of triumph before the inevitable return. The river Styx hummed beneath reality, ready to carry him home as it always did. Instead, the river screamed. The current of souls twisted violently, ripping sideways through dimensions that had no names. Zagreus felt the cosmic architecture of his father's domain lurch and shatter. This was not death. This was something older, something hungry. The boundaries between worlds tore open like wet parchment, and beyond them lay not Olympus, not the mortal realm, but a wound in existence itself. The warp took him. Zagreus tumbled through impossible colors and geometries that violated every law of creation. Voices shrieked in languages that predated language. Eyes without faces watched him fall. The boons of Olympus burned against his skin, divine gifts suddenly exposed to something that devoured divinity itself. Aphrodite's charm, Ares' bloodlust, Athena's deflection, all of them flickered like candles in a hurricane. The underworld's binding on his soul stretched across dimensions it was never meant to traverse. For the first time in his eternal cycle, Zagreus felt fear. Not fear of death. Death was familiar, almost comfortable. This was fear of the unknown, of a universe that operated by rules even the gods had never imagined. The warp crushed and stretched him simultaneously, trying to understand what he was, trying to claim him, trying to corrupt the essence of a being who belonged to another reality entirely. Demon whispers promised power, pleasure, glory, despair. Zagreus heard them all and recognized none of them. Then, as violently as it began, the fall ended. He crashed onto obsidian ground that cracked beneath his impact. Pain lanced through his body, real and sharp and mortal. Zagreus pushed himself upright, tasting blood, feeling wounds that should have killed him. His infernal arms materialized in his hands from pure instinct, Stygian blades humming with underworld power. He scanned his surroundings, warrior instincts overriding confusion. This was not the underworld. This was not anywhere he recognized. The sky above churned with colors that hurt to perceive, a roiling mass of energy and madness that seemed barely contained by the fabric of space itself. The ground beneath him was scorched and twisted, dotted with structures that might have been buildings once, but now resembled melted bone. In the distance, something that could have been a city burned with flames that gave no light, only shadow. Zagreus tried to call upon the boon. Dionysus' festive fog responded weakly. Zeus' lightning crackled but felt distant, as if the connection to Olympus had been stretched across an impossible gulf. The gods could still hear him, but their voices came from so far away they were barely whispers. He was not cut off entirely, but he was alone in a way he had never experienced. Then he felt it. The pull. The familiar tug of death trying to drag him back to the house of Hades, to his room, to Cerberus in the lounge and his father's disappointed gaze. Zagreus waited for the transition, for the pool of Styx to revive him, for the cycle to reset. Nothing happened. His wounds remained. His location remained. Death's door, always open, suddenly felt locked from the other side. The binding that made him immortal still existed. He could feel it wrapped around his soul like chains of shadow and blood, but the mechanism of return had been severed. Zagreus stood in a foreign cosmos where the rules of his existence no longer fully applied. For the first time since his birth, dying here might actually mean something. A sound split the air, half roar and half laughter, echoing from the twisted landscape. Shapes began to move in the darkness, things that walked on too many legs or no legs at all, entities that radiated wrongness like heat from a forge. They sensed him now, a foreign soul bleeding divine energy into a realm that fed on such things. Zagreus rolled his shoulders, feeling the weight of godblood in his veins, the legacy of the underworld in his bones. He had fought his way through hell itself 1,000 times. He had bested gods and monsters, champions and legends. Whatever this place was, whatever these creatures were, they would learn the same lesson everything else had learned. The son of Hades did not stay down. The first demon charged, and Zagreus met it with a smile that would have made Thanatos proud. His blades sang their old song, and even in this forsaken place the music of defiance rang clear and true. He did not know where he was. He did not know how to get home, but he knew how to fight, how to move, how to survive one more encounter. That had always been enough before. The battle began, and with it, the first ripples of a legend that would spread across a galaxy drowning in despair. A legend of a warrior dressed in red and shadow, who laughed at death because death had been his training ground. A legend of hope that refused to die, even when the universe itself demanded extinction. Zagreus had entered Warhammer 40,000, and nothing would ever be the same. The demons came in waves, as they always did when fresh prey entered their domain. Lesser imps materialized from the psychic winds, chittering and howling, their forms barely coherent in real space. Behind them, larger entities coalesced, horrors born from mortal nightmares and divine corruption. They sensed what Zagreus was immediately. A soul touched by death but not claimed by it, a being saturated with divine essence yet walking free of any true master's leash. To the warp he was a feast waiting to happen. The first imp lunged, claws extended toward Zagreus' throat. His blade intercepted it mid-air, the Stygian edge cutting through warp stuff like it was common flesh. The demon shrieked, not in pain but in confusion, as its essence scattered instead of reforming. The underworld's authority still held power here, even if diminished. Death recognized death, regardless of the cosmos. Zagreus moved like water through fire, his movements honed by countless runs through Tartarus. Dash, strike, reposition. His father's training and his mother's blood combined into something the demons had never encountered. He was not a psyker to be overwhelmed. He was not a warrior to be broken by fear. He was a god who had spent his entire existence learning to overcome impossible odds. A bloodletter manifested, one of Khorne's chosen warriors, brass armor steaming with eternal rage. It swung an axe that had tasted the blood of saints and champions. Zagreus sidestepped, let the blade pass within inches of his face, and drove both weapons into the demon's core. Ares' boon flared, multiplying the damage, feeding on the violence inherent to both realms. The bloodletter roared approval, even as it dissolved, recognizing a kindred spirit in the art of war. But Zagreus laughed, and that changed everything. Demons do not laugh. Mortals scream. Champions roar. Cultists gibber with mad ecstasy. But laughter, genuine mirth in the face of their horror, was something the warp had not heard in millennia. Zagreus fought with the joy of someone who had nothing left to lose, who had already lost everything so many times that losing again was just another Tuesday. His blades sang. His movements flowed. And through it all, he grinned like this was the most fun he had experienced in decades. A plague-bearer shambled forward, Nurgle's rot dripping from its wounds. Diseases that could end worlds clung to its skin. Zagreus hit it with Dionysus' hangover fog, underworld toxins clashing with warp plagues in a chemical war that ended with both canceling into harmless vapor. The demon looked down at its suddenly clean wounds with something resembling offense before Zagreus beheaded it with a spinning strike. Pink horror split and giggled, Tsinchi's changers trying to overwhelm through multiplication and mutation. Athena's deflection boon activated, turning their warp fire back on themselves. Zagreus dashed through the resulting chaos, each kill flowing into the next, building momentum the way he always had in the underworld's chambers. The muscle memory of 10,000 escape attempts turned this alien hellscape into just another challenge. In the Imperium, the dark gods stirred. Khorne felt the battle lust, the pure joy of combat without ambition or rage tainting it. This was war as art, not conquest. It intrigued the blood god in ways few mortals ever could. Here was someone who fought not for glory or hatred, but because fighting was simply what he did. There was honesty in that.
Purity even.
Tzeentch observed the chaos of chance and choice that surrounded Zagreus. The way each death in his past had changed him, taught him, made him evolve without corruption. Plans within plans existed in this being's history, yet none of them were schemes.
They were simply iterations of growth.
The architect of fate found this paradox delicious. Nurgle sensed the cycle, the endless death and rebirth, the acceptance of suffering as temporary and change as inevitable. This soul understood despair but had moved through it, not by rejecting it, but by outlasting it. The Plague Lord felt something almost like kinship, corrupted though the feeling was. Slaanesh tasted the defiance, the refusal to break, the intensity of sensation that came from someone who had experienced everything and still wanted more. Not more pleasure, not more pain, but more existence. The Dark Prince found this appetite fascinating, though the lack of true excess was disappointing. 4 gazes turned toward the Red Warrior simultaneously, and the warp itself shuddered. Zagreus felt the attention like weight on his soul. Pressure built around him, the full malevolent focus of entities that had broken gods and shattered civilizations. They reached for him, offering power beyond measure, promises of perfection, strength, knowledge, acceptance. The boons of darkness that had claimed trillions of souls across 10,000 years. Zagreus had heard similar offers before, in the House of Hades, from entities of the underworld who thought godblood made him easy to manipulate. He had learned early that accepting gifts with strings attached meant losing yourself piece by piece. The Olympians gave their boons freely, expecting nothing but glory in return. These voices wanted ownership. So he did what he always did when faced with impossible power trying to claim him. He refused. Not with words, not with grand declarations or defiant speeches. He simply kept fighting, kept moving, kept being exactly what he was, the son of Hades who chose his own path. The chaos gods could offer corruption, but they could not offer what Zagreus truly wanted. They could not offer home. They could not offer family. They could not offer the simple pleasure of choosing his own fate. The demons hesitated, just for a moment, as the dark gods withdrew their attention in confusion. No mortal refused them. No soul touched by the warp walked away unchanged. Yet this being, this anomaly from beyond their reality, treated their greatest weapon with indifference. Zagreus did not fear damnation because he had already lived in the underworld. He did not fear death because death was his oldest friend. He did not fear corruption because he knew exactly who he was, had tested that identity against every trial imaginable. The Chaos Gods realized something terrifying in that moment. They had found a soul they could not claim, a warrior they could not break, a legend they could not control. And he was already moving deeper into their galaxy, leaving broken demons and confused corruption in his wake. Somewhere in the Imperium, on a dying world, people were about to meet hope without permission. And the Imperium of man was about to learn that not all gods demanded worship. The hive world of Atramor Prime was dying by inches. Its skies had turned the color of infected wounds, perpetual storms churning with energies that made augurs scream and psychers weep blood. Chaos cultists had risen from the Underhive 3 months ago, corrupting entire sectors before the planetary defense force could respond. Now the Imperium held the upper spires by sheer stubbornness and the barrels of 1,000,000 lasguns, while below, the ruinous powers prepared rituals that would birth something terrible into reality. Commissar Hallen stood on the battlements of Cathedral District 7, watching his men die. They were good soldiers, loyal to the Emperor, faithful unto death. But faith did not stop demonic blades. Loyalty did not cauterize plague wounds. They held the line because that was what the Imperium demanded, And when they fell, fresh conscripts stepped into their places, knowing they would fall too.
This was the calculus of 40,000.
Hold until relief arrived or everyone died. There were no other options. The cultists charged again at dawn, a wave of corrupted humanity screaming prayers to dark gods. Lost fire cut them down by the hundreds, but hundreds more kept coming. The line held.
Barely.
Hallen executed a trooper who broke ranks, not out of cruelty but necessity. Fear spread faster than plague in siege conditions. One coward could collapse an entire regiment. Then the sky tore open and something fell. At first, Hallen thought it was a drop pod, some last desperate reinforcement from orbit. But no drop pod moved like that, twisting mid-air to land on its feet with inhuman grace. No Space Marine war armor of layered shadow and laurel crowns. And no Imperial warrior landed in the middle of the cultist charge and immediately started laughing. Zagreus hit the ground between the two armies and exploded into motion. His blades carved through the first rank of cultists before they could process his arrival. Blood sprayed in arcs that caught the corrupted light, painting the rockcrete in patterns of violence. He moved like nothing Hallen had ever seen, not with the calculated precision of an Astartes or the augmented speed of a Sister of Battle, but with fluid joy, like someone dancing to music only he could hear. A cultist champion, armor fused with demonic flesh, swung a chain axe at Zagreus' head. The prince of the underworld ducked under it, came up inside the champion's guard, and drove both blades through corrupted organs. The champion fell, disbelief frozen on its mutated face. Zagreus was already gone, flowing to the next target, then the next, each kill building momentum. The cultist charge broke against him like water against stone. Hallen stared, his bolt pistol forgotten in his hand. His soldiers stared. Even the cultists stared, their advance stuttering as they watched one man tear through their vanguard without slowing. This was not tactics or firepower. This was something primal, a predator moving through prey, and for the first time in 3 months of siege, the servants of chaos felt hunted. Zagreus spun through a cluster of plague-ridden madmen, his blade singing. Dionysus' fog erupted from his wake, intoxicating and disorienting. Cultists turned on each other in confusion. He laughed again, that bright sound so out of place in this gray world, and the laughter carried across the battlefield like a battle hymn. A demon materialized, drawn by the sudden surge of violence and hope clashing. It was a lesser thing, all teeth and malice, but still deadly enough to massacre an entire platoon. Zagreus met its charge head-on, no hesitation, no fear. Their clash sent shockwaves across the rockcrete. The demon's claws scraped against Athena's deflection. Zagreus' blades found warped flesh and bit deep, underworld authority burning through chaos corruption. The demon died screaming, and Zagreus simply stepped over its dissolving corpse to engage the next threat. Behind the Imperial lines, a civilian huddle caught his eye. Refugees from the lower levels, trapped when the front line shifted, too old or young or wounded to evacuate. Cultists had flanked around, were closing in for the slaughter, and the nearest guard platoon was too engaged to help. Zagreus changed direction instantly. He crossed 50 meters in seconds, his dash leaving afterimages of shadow and red. The cultists, raising their crude weapons, found themselves facing a demigod instead of helpless prey. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution, surgical and swift. Zagreus positioned himself between the civilians and danger, and anything that tried to pass him simply died. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, stared up at him with eyes too old for her age. 3 months of siege had taught her that adults died, heroes did not exist, and tomorrow would be worse than today. She had never seen anyone smile during a battle. She had never heard laughter that was not mad or cruel. Zagreus knelt beside her for just a moment, even as combat raged around them. He said something, words in a language she did not understand, but the tone was gentle, reassuring. Then he stood, his blades moving again, carving a path of safety through horror. Commissar Hallen found his voice. Orders barked across the Vox network. Squads repositioned to support this unknown fighter. to capitalize on the chaos he had created in the enemy ranks. Tactical doctrine said to be suspicious of unsanctioned assets, to question miracles, to assume corruption until proven otherwise. But Hallen was also a man who had watched 10,000 soldiers die in 3 months, who had executed deserters and blessed martyrs, and done everything required to hold one city block against hell itself. And this red warrior, whoever or whatever he was killing the enemy with a smile, saving civilians without orders, fighting like every life mattered instead of just victory. For 3 months, a Warhammer Prime had known only despair dressed as duty.
Hope was heresy. Optimism was weak.
Survival meant accepting that you were already dead. The Imperium taught its citizens to embrace martyrdom, to see death in service as the highest calling, to expect nothing but suffering until the Emperor finally ended their watch. Zagreus had not received that indoctrination. He fought like he expected to win. He protected civilians like their lives had value. He laughed in the face of demons like they were inconveniences rather than apocalyptic threats. And somehow, impossibly, the soldiers around him began to remember what it felt like to fight for something instead of just against something. The cultist attack broke. Survivors fled back into the underhive, their momentum shattered by one warrior and the sudden spine in the defenders he had inspired. The battlefield fell quiet except for the moans of the wounded and the crackle of fires. Zagreus stood in the center of it all, his blade still humming with underworld power, blood dripping from his armor in patterns that seemed almost artistic. He looked around at the gray world, the gray soldiers, the gray hope trying to reignite in exhausted eyes. Then he grinned, shouldered his weapons, and started walking toward the next fight.
Because that was what he did. That was what he had always done.
There were people to save, enemies to fight, and death to laugh at. Behind him, Commissar Hallen lowered his bolt pistol and made a decision that might cost him his soul. He did not order his men to detain the stranger.
He did not call for the Inquisition.
Not yet.
Because for the first time in 3 months, his soldiers looked like they remembered they were human. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that was a miracle worth dying for. The Inquisition arrived on Warhammer Prime 6 days after Zagreus' appearance, which was 6 days longer than it usually took for them to notice something wrong. In a galaxy of constant crisis, one hive world's siege barely registered. But when reports filtered through Vox channels about a red warrior who laughed at demons and refused the Emperor's benediction, Inquisitor Castira paid attention. She had hunted heretics for 40 years, purged cults, burned psychers, and executed planetary governors for the crime of weakness.
Her faith was iron wrapped in steel, wrapped in ceramite. She knew corruption in all its forms, the obvious taint of mutation, the subtle whisper of ambition, the desperate bargain of those who thought they could control darkness. This red warrior fit none of her categories, and that made him the most dangerous of all. Her retinue cornered Zagreus in the ruins of District 12, where he had been clearing cultist holdouts and evacuating trapped civilians for 3 days straight without rest. He turned to face them without alarm, simply curious about the new arrivals. 8 stormtroopers in carapace armor, 2 sanctioned psychers with their handlers. An assassin she knew was there even though she could not see them. And Castira herself, rosette gleaming with the authority to end worlds. She expected fear. She got a smile.
Zagreus looked at the weapons pointed at him and shrugged, his posture relaxed, unbothered. He had stood before the god of the dead countless times. He had faced the fury of Olympus and the judgment of powers beyond mortal comprehension. These soldiers, skilled though they were, did not frighten him. Nothing in this strange galaxy had frightened him yet. That lack of fear confirmed every suspicion Castira had. The interrogation began in a commandeered administratum building, its walls still scarred from fighting. They bound Zagreus in chains blessed by the ecclesiarchy, inscribed with prayers meant to suppress warp entities. The chains held his body but could not touch his essence. He sat calmly, waiting, while psychers prepared their probes and Castira reviewed reports of his actions.
He had saved thousands,
killed cultists and demons with equal efficiency. displayed powers that resembled psyker abilities but moved through different channels entirely. He spoke Gothic fluently despite claiming to be from somewhere called Greece. He carried weapons that registered as both archaeotech and something older, something that predated human civilization entirely.
And he would not kneel to the emperor.
Castira began the interrogation with standard questions.
Name, origin, purpose.
Zagreus answered honestly, because he had never learned to lie well. He told her about the underworld, about Hades, about dying 1,000 times to escape his father's domain. He spoke of Olympus and the gods, of his mother Persephone, of boons and prophecies. The psychers listening to his mind recoiled in horror. They sought truth in his words, but truth that broke their understanding of reality. His soul was not human, not even posthuman. It was something divine, bound to death itself, but not owned by any of the chaos gods. When they tried to probe deeper, to understand the mechanism of his immortality, they touched the underworld's essence and screamed. One psyker collapsed, bleeding from her eyes. The other yanked free of the mental link, gasping about rivers of souls and a realm that existed in defiance of the warp itself. Castira had seen enough. This being was a threat to the Imperium's cosmic order, a creature that operated outside the Emperor's light and the warp's corruption simultaneously. He was a third option, an alternative to the binary of faith or damnation.
And alternatives were heresy.
She declared him condemned. The stormtroopers raised their weapons. The remaining psyker gathered his power for an execution strike. Zagreus sighed, almost disappointed, and died for the first time in this new galaxy. The shot took him through the heart, a perfect kill. His body slumped in the chains. Blood pooled on the interrogation room floor. The room fell silent as Castira began composing her report, already planning the purge of everyone who had been inspired by the Red Warrior's brief presence.
Then Zagreus stood up.
The chains clattered to the floor, no longer holding anything. His corpse remained in the chair, blood still fresh, wounds still smoking from lost fire. But Zagreus himself stood behind the stormtroopers, his blades already in hand, his expression calm. He had returned through the underworld's binding, his soul yanked back from wherever it tried to go, reconstituted through sheer divine stubbornness. Death, it seemed, did not work the same way here. But it still did not work on him.
Chaos erupted.
Stormtroopers spun, firing at point-blank range. Lost bolts and solid slugs tore through Zagreus, punching holes in flesh and armor. He staggered but kept moving, his regeneration already knitting wounds. The assassin struck from the shadows, a blade coated in toxins that could kill a space marine. Zagreus died again, his throat opened, choking on blood. He returned 30 seconds later, appearing at the room's far side, completely healed.
Castira watched her certainties crumble.
This was not warp resurrection, where demons reformed from belief and sacrifice. This was something else entirely, a mechanism that belonged to a different cosmos, operating by rules the Imperium had never encountered. He was not unkillable, but he was impossible to keep dead.
Zagreus did not attack.
He could have slaughtered everyone in the room, his speed and skill more than sufficient. Instead, he simply left, walking through the door while stormtroopers emptied their magazines into his retreating form. He died twice more in the hallway, once from concentrated fire and once from a crack grenade. Each time he returned, always moving away, never retaliating. He escaped into the Hive City's ruins, vanishing into the same warrens where he had saved so many civilians. Castira stood in the interrogation room, staring at 3 corpses that should not exist simultaneously, and felt something she had not experienced in decades.
Doubt. She had condemned a being who saved lives.
She had executed someone whose only crimes were helping the helpless and refusing to worship the Emperor. And he had responded not with vengeance but by simply continuing his self-appointed mission, as if her judgment meant nothing, as if the Inquisition's authority was just another obstacle in a long history of obstacles.
Castira filed her report.
She called for reinforcements.
She branded Zagreus a heretic of the highest order.
But in the privacy of her chambers, she wondered if she had just made a terrible mistake, Because the Imperium taught that hope without the Emperor was delusion. Zagreus proved that hope could exist without permission.
And that was the most dangerous heresy of all.
The Chaos forces made hunting Zagreus their priority, and that was their first mistake. Across a dozen systems in the Vaulter sector, cults received visions, demons manifested with purpose, and warbands coordinated in ways Chaos rarely managed. The dark gods wanted this anomaly destroyed, studied, or corrupted. They poured resources into the hunt with an intensity usually reserved for crusading Black Templars or awakening Necron tomb worlds.
Zagreus, for his part, did not make it easy.
On Morden Fee, a Cornate warband tracked him to a factorum where refugees hid from the killing fields. The bloodbound expected to corner prey. Instead, they walked into a storm of Stygian fury. Zagreus fought them in the narrow corridors between massive machinery, using terrain the way he had used Tartarus chambers. Each death taught him more about this galaxy's threats. Each resurrection brought him back with that knowledge intact. The warband's champion, a former space marine twisted by decades of service to the blood god, dueled Zagreus in the factorum's heart. The traitor's power armor and corrupted strength should have been overwhelming. But Zagreus had fought Theseus, had matched blades with the champion of Elysium hundreds of times, had learned to overcome enemies who should have been his superior. He died 3 times in that duel, each death teaching him the champion's patterns, the tells before each strike, the rhythm of corrupted battle doctrine. On the 4th confrontation, Zagreus won, his blades finding the gaps in ancient ceramite, ending a warrior who had slaughtered thousands. The refugees escaped while Chaos searched for his corpse. On Gallus Prime, Tzinche's cults tried a different approach. They laid traps of infinite complexity, schemes within schemes, designed to bind an immortal soul in temporal loops and warp mazes. Zagreus walked into their snares willingly, died to their carefully prepared executions, and returned each time with increasing understanding of how their corruption worked. The underworld had taught him about cycles, about patterns, about escaping systems designed to be inescapable. These schemes, elaborate though they were just puzzles with murderous consequences. And Zagreus had spent his entire existence solving deadly puzzles. By the 5th resurrection, he navigated their traps from memory. By the 10th, he started using their own schemes against them, turning demons summoning circles into banishment wards through sheer defiant improvisation. The sorcerers watching through scrying pools felt something they rarely experienced: confusion. Their perfect plans unraveled not through counter-schemes but through simple, stubborn persistence. Nurgle's plagues came next, diseases that had ended civilizations unleashed to rot the unkillable warrior from within. Zagreus caught them all, suffered through corruption that turned his flesh to soup, died screaming as his organs liquefied. He returned pristine, his resurrection burning away taint. The plagues taught him nothing useful, but they failed to keep him down, and that was victory enough. The plague marines who delivered the diseases watched him rise again and again, their rotted hearts uncertain. Nurgle taught acceptance of decay, the inevitability of entropy, the comfort of surrender. But this warrior surrendered to nothing. He experienced their gifts of plague and still rejected them, still chose to fight, still dragged himself forward even when his body was more diseased than flesh. One plague marine, ancient beyond measure, spoke words that would ripple through chaos forces across the sector. The Red One does not despair. And without despair we have no hold. Slanesh's cults tried seduction next, offering pleasures and sensations beyond mortal comprehension. But Zagreus had been offered temptation before, in the underworld, by entities who understood desire in ways these crude cults could not match. He walked through their pleasure palaces with the same disinterest he showed their torture chambers. Pain and pleasure were just sensations, and he had experienced both in measures that made their offerings seem quaint. When they finally tried to kill him in frustration, he obliged by dying, then returned to continue his real work, saving the people these cults were tormenting. Word spread through the warp like infection through a wound. The anomaly could not be kept. The Red Warrior returned from every death, learned from every defeat, adapted to every trap. Chaos forces began to hesitate when they encountered him, their certainty shaken by a target who treated damnation like another day at the office. On Krenya's landing, a demon prince descended to end this personally. It was an ancient thing, elevated to demonhood and the heresy itself, powerful enough to crack planets. It found Zagreus defending an evacuation convoy and attacked with the fury of 10,000 years of corruption. The battle lasted 6 hours.
Zagreus died 11 times.
Each death, the demon prince felt a flicker of something wrong.
This soul should be claimed. This essence should be devoured.
But the underworld's binding was stronger than the warp's hunger, rooted in laws that predated even the chaos god's awakening. On the 12th confrontation, exhausted and bleeding, Zagreus landed a perfect strike. His blades, empowered by every boon Olympus could channel across cosmic distances, pierced the demon's essence and found the mortal soul buried beneath millennia of corruption. For just a moment, the fallen champion remembered humanity, remembered the Imperium they had betrayed, remembered oaths sworn before everything went wrong. The demon prince died, truly died, its essence scattered beyond reformation. And Zagreus, bleeding out on the ground, managed a weak laugh before succumbing to his wounds. He rose again as the convoy escaped, mission accomplished, another impossible victory added to a growing legend. The stories spread faster than chaos could suppress them. Imperial Guard regiments whispered about the Red Warrior who saved Morden Fee. Refugees spoke of the laughing god who defied plague. Resistance fighters on occupied worlds heard legends of someone who fought alone against demon princes and won through simple refusal to quit. The Imperium's authorities tried to suppress the tales, declaring them heretical fabrications meant to undermine faith in the Emperor. But soldiers who had fought beside Zagreus, civilians who had been saved by his intervention, they knew the truth. They had seen hope bleed and die and return, had witnessed defiance that operated outside the Imperium's doctrine of martyrdom. In the warp, the dark gods convened in ways they rarely did, their attention focused on this single anomaly. He was not powerful enough to threaten them directly, but he was proving something dangerous to their hold on the galaxy. That their greatest weapon, the fear of death and damnation, could be overcome by simply refusing to stay broken. Khorne wanted him as a champion, entranced by his endless warrior spirit. Tzeentch wanted to study him, to understand the mechanism that let him escape death. Nurgle wanted to show him the peace of surrender. Slaanesh wanted to own the perfection of his persistence. But Zagreus belonged to none of them, wanted nothing they offered, and kept fighting for reasons they could not comprehend. He did not fight for glory or power or even survival. He fought because people needed help and he could provide it.
Simple.
Human. Devastating in its purity. Chaos learned a hard lesson in those months. You cannot break what refuses to acknowledge it is broken. And across the Imperium, in the darkest war zones and most desperate sieges, people began to believe in something they were not supposed to believe in.
A hero who kept getting back up.
The Ultramarine strike cruiser Fidelitas Invictus translated into the Volter sector, responding to reports of warp instability and heretical activity. Captain Arius Leonis commanded the Third Company, veterans of 100 campaigns, warriors who had defended humanity for centuries. They expected another brutal cleansing operation, another sector consumed by chaos that needed to be cut out like infected tissue. What they found instead was confusion wrapped in contradiction. Imperial forces reported a Red Warrior fighting chaos with abilities that resembled both Psyker powers and Xenos technology. The Inquisition had declared him heretic. Local guard commanders praised him as a savior. Civilian populations regarded him with something approaching worship despite his constant rejections of such devotion. Every report contradicted the next, a tangle of information that made tactical assessment nearly impossible. Captain Leonis decided to observe before making judgment. His company deployed to Outramore Prime, where Zagreus had first appeared, now under full siege again after Chaos renewed its assault with vengeance. The Ultramarines' drop pods hammered into Cathedral District 7 like the Emperor's own judgment, and within hours they had stabilized a front that had been collapsing for days. Then Zagreus arrived and everything became complicated. He appeared during a demon incursion, dozens of warp entities materializing in the refugee quarter behind ultramarine lines. Standard doctrine called for immediate evacuation of all personnel, followed by saturation bombardment to deny the enemy their foothold. Acceptable losses in exchange for preventing a larger infestation. Zagreus did not follow standard doctrine. He hit the demon line from the side, alone, moving with speed that made even enhanced Astartes' vision struggle to track. His weapons, ancient and obviously powerful, carved through warp flesh like they were specifically designed for the task. He fought with techniques that resembled nothing in Imperial combat doctrine, fluid and improvisational, more dance than warfare. Brother Sergeant Octavius, leading the nearest tactical squad, watched this impossible display and made a decision. His squad repositioned to support, bolter fire coordinating with Zagreus' melee assault without communication or planning. The Ultramarines adapted because adaptation was written into their gene code, and this Red Warrior was killing the enemy with efficiency that demanded respect regardless of authorization. Together they destroyed the incursion in 12 minutes.
No civilian casualty, no Space Marine loss.
A tactical victory that should have required 3 times the forces and accepted significant collateral damage. Captain Leonis confronted Zagreus personally in the aftermath, his command squad arrayed in combat formation. The captain stood in full Mark X power armor, a warrior who had broken sieges and commanded armies. He had expected to intimidate or at least impress this unknown fighter. Zagreus looked up at the captain, taking in the ceramite perfection and transhuman majesty, and simply asked if there were more civilians that needed evacuation. The question was so genuine, so unburdened by political calculation or tactical posturing, that Leonis paused.
This was not how heretics spoke.
It was not even how sanctioned heroes spoke. This was someone asking a practical question about practical needs, as if the presence of the Emperor's angels of death was less important than logistics. Leonis explained the Codex Astartes' position on unknown combatants. Zagreus listened politely, then explained he had been fighting monsters since before he could remember. And whether those monsters served chaos or wore different faces did not change his approach. He would keep helping people until someone gave him a better reason to stop than just procedure.
The captain could have ordered his arrest. Should have by multiple regulations.
But Leonis had not commanded for 2 centuries by being inflexible.
He proposed a test instead. Fight beside his company for 1 week, follow tactical coordination, demonstrate that his abilities served humanity rather than corruption. If Zagreus proved trustworthy, Leonis would advocate for him with the Inquisition. If he showed taint, execution would be swift. Zagreus agreed with a shrug that suggested he had never doubted his own purity and found the entire conversation slightly absurd. The week that followed became legend among the Ultramarines' 3rd Company. Zagreus fought in every major engagement, coordinated with squad tactics despite no formal training, and displayed combat capabilities that put him somewhere between a skilled Astartes and a minor demon prince in raw effectiveness. He died 4 times during the week, each death from injuries that would have ended anyone else, and returned each time within hours, location shifting impossibly but always back in the fight. What impressed the Ultramarines most was not his power but his purpose. He never fought for glory or honor, concepts that motivated most warriors. He fought because civilians needed protection, because the enemy needed stopping, because it was simply the right thing to do. There was no ego in his combat style, no showboating or attempts to prove superiority. Brother Octavius, who had fought beside Zagreus most often, reported something unusual to Captain Leonis. The Red Warrior treated Space Marines as equals, not superiors or threats, just fellow soldiers doing the same work. He complimented their tactics, asked questions about their gene enhancements with genuine curiosity, and shared stories of his own battles with a humility that seemed at odds with his obvious divine nature. On the 6th day, they fought a Chaos champion together, Zagreus and Captain Leonis, while the 3rd Company held the surrounding forces at bay. The champion was a former Imperial fist, fallen to Khorne, powerful enough to threaten even a veteran captain in Terminator armor. The duel was brutal,
testing both warriors to their limits. Zagreus died protecting Leonise from a blow that would have decapitated the captain. He simply stepped into the strike, took the demon weapon through his chest, and gave Leonis the opening to deliver the killing blow. He returned an hour later, apologizing for being late to the next engagement. Captain Leonise filed his report that night, and for the first time in his career, he found himself arguing against inquisitorial judgment.
His conclusion was simple: Zagreus was not corrupt.
He was not a threat to the Imperium. He was simply a warrior from another place, fighting the same enemies by different means, guided by principles that aligned with humanity's survival even if they did not align with imperial doctrine. The Inquisition rejected his report. They declared Zagreus a priority target, corruption too subtle to detect but certainly present. No being could resist death unless tainted by the warp. No warrior could fight without seeking glory unless motivated by darker bargains. Leonise stood on the bridge of his strike cruiser and made a decision that might end his career. He sent a private message to Zagreus, warning him of the kill order, giving him time to disappear before the full might of the Inquisition descended. Because the Ultramarines followed the Codex, but they also followed their conscience. And sometimes, those two imperatives did not align as neatly as the Imperium preferred to believe. Inquisitor Lord Vashkon did not believe in half measures. When corruption took root, you burned the root, the soil, and everything within 100 kilometers. When heresy spread, you silenced every voice that heard it. When a world fell beyond redemption, you ended the world. This was not cruelty. This was mercy, the kindness of preventing greater suffering through decisive action. Tremor Prime had become infected, not just with chaos but with something worse, unsanctioned hope. The population spoke of the Red Warrior in hushed tones of reverence. Guard regiments showed reluctance in following purge orders, questioning whether everyone tainted by contact with the heretic needed execution. Even Space Marines had filed contradictory reports, some calling for Zagreus' destruction, others advocating for study or even recruitment. This ideological contamination could spread faster than any plague. Vashkon had seen it before, the way alternative thinking could fracture the Imperium's unity. One world questioning doctrine became a sector questioning authority, became a crusade questioning the Emperor's will. Better to end it now decisively with fire that left no room for doubt. He invoked his authority and ordered exterminatus. The virus bombs were already loaded, ancient weapons from the Great Crusade, capable of reducing a planet's entire biosphere to inert sludge in hours. After the virus did its work, cyclonic torpedoes would crack the crust, ensuring nothing survived, nothing remained, nothing could ever spread from Tremor Prime again. 10 billion souls would die, but 10 billion martyrs were acceptable when measured against potential heresy infecting entire segmentums. Zagreus learned of the order from the same Ultramarine warning that had helped him evade capture. He stood in the ruins of District 12, surrounded by refugees he had been protecting, and processed what exterminatus meant. The Imperium would kill everyone on this world, guilty and innocent alike, because his presence had somehow made faith complicated. He could leave. Should leave. His mission was to survive, to find a way home, not to die pointlessly for people he barely knew in a galaxy that wanted him dead. The smart choice, the strategic choice, was to disappear into the hive's depths and let the Imperium do what it always did. Zagreus had never been good at making smart choices. He spent the next 2 days organizing evacuation, pulling every favor, calling on every guard unit he had fought beside, every civilian he had saved, every person who owed him a debt or simply believed in what he represented. Ships were commandeered, cargo haulers and system runners, anything with a warp drive and space for passengers. The Ultramarines' Third Company, defying direct orders, provided cover for the evacuation zones. The Inquisition noticed, of course. They accelerated the timeline. Vashkon ordered the fleet to begin bombardment even as evacuation ships struggled to reach orbit. The virus bombs would deploy in 6 hours. After that, everyone still on the planet would die, no exceptions, no mercy. Zagreus moved through the hive like a red storm, herding civilians toward extraction points, fighting through cultist ambushes and demon manifestations drawn by the planet's death sentence. He died 7 times in those 6 hours, each death from pushing too hard, fighting too many enemies, carrying too many wounded through hostile territory when vehicles failed and time ran out. Each time he returned, he kept working. Inquisitor Vashkhan watched from orbit, monitoring the frantic evacuation through auger returns. He saw one thermal signature moving faster than human limits, appearing in multiple districts simultaneously as death and resurrection created the illusion of omnipresence. The Red Warrior was trying to save everyone, an impossible task that revealed either divine arrogance or mortal compassion. Either way, it changed nothing. The virus bombs deployed on schedule, warheads screaming through the atmosphere toward population centers. Zagreus was in Cathedral District 7 when the first bomb hit, helping load children onto the last evacuation transport. He felt the change in air pressure, smelled the chemical precursor of Life-Eater virus, and knew he was out of time. The transport was overloaded, packed beyond safety limits with refugees who had survived 3 months of siege only to face extinction by their own Imperium. The pilot was screaming that they could not take off with this much weight, that the engines would fail, that everyone would die if they tried. Zagreus climbed onto the hull and told them to fly anyway. The transport lurched into the air, struggling against mass and gravity and failing engines. Below, the virus spread in clouds of accelerated death, dissolving everything organic it touched. Above, inquisitorial fighters patrolled the escape corridor, under orders to destroy any ship that looked infected or compromised. Zagreus clung to the transport's exterior, using his strength to physically hold damaged hull plates together, his body acting as a counterweight to balance the overloaded craft.
Lost fire from cultist positions hammered the ship.
A demon manifested in the air itself, drawn by the concentration of terror and hope. Zagreus fought it one-handed while holding the transport stable with the other, his blades singing against warp flesh while metal groaned beneath him. He died when the demon's claw tore through his chest, the wound catastrophic even for him. He fell from the transport, tumbling toward the virus clouds below. Inside the ship, children screamed, seeing their protector lost. The pilot pushed the engines to maximum, using the sudden weight reduction to claw for altitude. Zagreus returned, clinging to the landing gear, pulled back into existence by sheer determination and the underworld's refusal to release him. He was bleeding, exhausted, running on fumes and stubbornness. But the transport was still flying, still climbing, and that was enough. They reached orbit as the cyclonic torpedoes struck, the planet cracking behind them in flowers of nuclear fire. 50 evacuation ships escaped, carrying maybe 2 million people out of 10 billion. A catastrophic loss by any measure. The greatest rescue operation Zagreus had ever attempted.
Both things were true simultaneously.
Inquisitor Vashkhan ordered the evacuation fleet detained, prepared to purge every survivor for potential taint. The Ultramarines' third company positioned themselves between the inquisitorial ships and the refugees, weapons locked, a silent declaration of protection that bordered on open rebellion. A standoff developed in the orbital space above Atramar Prime's burning corpse, 2 interpretations of Imperial law facing each other across weapon ranges. In the middle, clinging to a damaged transport, Zagreus simply tried to catch his breath and figure out what to do next. The Inquisition saw an abomination that undermined faith through unauthorized miracles. The Ultramarines saw a warrior who had fought beside them with honor. The refugees saw someone who had died for them, repeatedly, asking nothing in return. And throughout the sector and war zones and siege lines, on dying worlds and desperate battlefields, people heard the story. They heard about the Red Warrior who defied exterminatus, who chose certain death over abandoning civilians, who kept returning no matter how many times he fell. The Imperium could suppress information, execute witnesses, burn records. But they could not erase hope once people remembered what it felt like. And Zagreus, bleeding and exhausted in the void above a murdered world, had reminded an entire sector that hope was possible, even when the universe itself said otherwise. The warp does not forgive insults, and Zagreus had become an insult incarnate. His continued existence mocked everything the chaos gods represented.
He should have been claimed, corrupted, or destroyed.
Instead, he wandered their galaxy like a tourist, fighting their champions, saving their victims, treating damnation like a minor inconvenience. The dark gods decided this required personal attention. The cicatrix maledictum, that great wound across reality, pulsed with unusual activity. Warp storms gathered at its edges, directed by malevolent intelligence toward a singular purpose. Deep in the Imperium, the chaos gods prepared an arena, a space carved from the stuff of nightmares where they could confront this anomaly directly. Not through champions or demons, but through their own avatars, projections of power that had broken greater gods than Zagreus claimed to be.
The trap was elegant.
A distress call from a refugee fleet, caught in a warp storm, slowly being pulled into the maledictum's maw. Zagreus, having established a pattern of reckless heroism, could not resist. He commandeered a shuttle, ignoring warnings from every authority, and flew directly into the storm that was obviously, transparently a trap. He had escaped the underworld 1,000 times. What was one more impossible situation? The warp took him gently this time, not the violent transition of his first arrival, but a seductive pull into depths beyond mortal comprehension.
Space twisted. Time became negotiable.
Zagreus found himself standing on a platform of condensed nightmare, surrounded by 4 thrones that burned with the essence of entropy itself.
The chaos gods manifested.
Not fully, not in their complete apocalyptic glory that would shatter reality itself, but in aspects powerful enough to unmake souls and break worlds. Khorne appeared as a mountain of brass and rage,
Tzeentch as a kaleidoscope of impossible angles,
Nurgle as a garden of beautiful decay,
Slaanesh as a sensation that could not be described without going mad.
They spoke with voices that rewrote the laws of physics with each syllable. They offered him everything he could want and things he could not imagine wanting. Power to return home.
Divinity beyond his father's limitations.
The chance to save everyone he had failed to save. All he had to do was accept their patronage, become their champion, serve their great games. Zagreus, standing before entities that had corrupted galaxies, gave them the same answer he had given similar offers in the underworld.
No.
The refusal was simple, unadorned by philosophy or grand declarations. Just a warrior stating a preference, as casually as declining a drink. The chaos gods had prepared for arguments, for bargaining, for the complex dance of temptation they had perfected over eons. They had not prepared for someone who simply was not interested. Khorne attacked first, because subtlety was not the blood god's strength. An avatar of pure violence descended, reality screaming at its presence. Zagreus met it head-on, his blades against the conceptual essence of war itself. He died in 3 seconds, obliterated by power no mortal frame could withstand. He returned behind Khorne's avatar, striking at what might be called a back if such entities had conventional anatomy. His weapons, empowered by the underworld and Olympus, bit into warp stuff and drew something resembling pain. Khorne laughed, delighted by a warrior who understood that death was just another part of combat. They fought across the platform, Zagreus dying and returning, each resurrection teaching him more about fighting a god. He had learned this lesson against Hades, against the champions of Elysium, in endless duels where victory seemed impossible. You studied the patterns. You adapt. You persisted until you found the weakness or created one through sheer attrition. Tzeentch tried next, schemes within schemes unfolding in ways that twisted causality. Zagreus found himself fighting versions of himself, temporal echoes and alternative possibilities made manifest. Every choice he made spawned new enemies, new challenges, new impossibilities. The changer of ways showed him futures where he won, and futures where he failed, all equally real, all demanding he choose correctly or be lost forever. Zagreus closed his eyes and swung blindly, trusting instinct over thought. Prophecy was just another trap, and he had spent his whole life learning to ignore predictions. The futures collapsed into singular now, and his blade found Tzeentch's avatar, drawing a shriek of frustration from the architect of fate. Nurgle's garden sprouted around him, beautiful and toxic. The plague god offered peace, acceptance, the end of struggle. Zagreus could stop fighting, stop dying, stop carrying the weight of everyone's suffering. Just surrender to inevitability, embrace the cycle, rot into something greater than mere godling. Zagreus laughed, and the sound carried genuine amusement. He had been offered this before, by darkness and despair in the underworld's depths. The peace of giving up, of accepting that nothing mattered, that all effort was futile. He had rejected it then by simply continuing to move forward. He rejected it now the same way. The garden withered at his laughter, life and death cycling too fast for rot to take hold. Slaanesh came last, and the Dark Prince was patient. It did not offer pleasure or pain, having learned those were not Zagreus' weaknesses. Instead, it offered meaning.
Purpose.
The chance to matter in a universe that ground everything to dust eventually. Serve Slaanesh and every death would have significance, every sacrifice would echo through eternity, every life saved would be remembered forever. Zagreus paused at that, and Slaanesh smiled, sensing vulnerability. This warrior fought for others, bled for strangers, died for people he would never see again. He wanted his actions to mean something, wanted proof that all this suffering had purpose. Then Zagreus shook his head, and the moment passed. Meaning was not something granted by gods. It was something you created through action, whether anyone remembered or not. He had learned that from his mother, from his friends in the underworld, from every failed escape attempt that mattered simply because he had tried. The Chaos gods realized their mistake then. They had approached Zagreus as they approached all potential champions, with offers designed for those who wanted something desperately enough to pay any price. But Zagreus did not want anything from them. He wanted to go home, yes, but not at the cost of himself. He wanted to help people, but not for recognition or reward. He simply was who he was, unchanging and incorruptible, not because of some special resistance, but because he had already decided what he valued and refused to compromise, even when compromise seemed rational. The platform began to dissolve, the Chaos gods withdrawing their attention. They could not claim him,
Could not break him.
could not even understand him properly, because he operated by internal logic that their corruption could not penetrate.
He was not immune to chaos.
He simply did not engage with it on terms that gave it power over him. Zagreus fell through the warp, ejected from the trap, still alive, still himself. The refugee fleet he had tried to save was gone, consumed, or scattered. He had failed his immediate mission. But he had proven something the galaxy needed proven, even if only a handful of psychers and seers witnessed it through the warp's chaos. The dark gods could be faced.
Their offers could be refused.
Damnation was not inevitable, corruption not unavoidable. And sometimes, the greatest rebellion was simply remaining yourself when the universe demanded you become something else. Zagreus returned to real space and immediately started looking for the next fight, the next crisis, the next impossible situation where someone needed help. Because that was what he did. That was what he would always do. And in the warp, the Chaos gods turned their attention to other matters, but a seed of uncertainty remained. An anomaly they could not solve, a warrior they could not claim. A tiny crack in their eternal dominance. Small cracks could become chasms given time. And time was one thing Zagreus had in abundance.
5 years passed in the galaxy's endless war. Empires rose and fell by inches.
Trillions died in conflicts whose names would be forgotten before the battles ended. The Imperium ground forward through sheer momentum, the machine of humanity too vast to stop even when every component screamed for rest. Chaos pushed and retreated in patterns older than recorded history. And through it all, Zagreus kept fighting. He never stopped moving, never settled, never accepted the thrones or temples people tried to build in his name. He appeared in the worst war zones, the desperate last stands, the sieges where hope had long since evacuated. He fought beside Imperial Guard regiments and Space Marine chapters, defended hive cities and agri-worlds, saved civilians who would never know his name and nobles who would never thank him. He became mythology in motion, a story that soldiers told around dying fires. The Red Warrior who laughed at death, the hero who could not be killed, the god who refused worship. Different worlds called him different things. Some thought he was a living saint the emperors will manifest. Others branded him the worst heretic since Horus. Most simply called him the legend and tried to survive another day. The Inquisition hunted him without success. He died to their assassins, their traps, their execution squads. He always returned, usually to save the same people the Inquisition had deemed acceptable casualties. Kill teams learned to recognize the pattern. If Zagreus appeared, innocents were about to be saved, and anyone standing between him and that goal would have a very bad day.
Some inquisitors gave up the hunt.
Others made it their life's work. None succeeded in keeping him down permanently. The Space Marines developed a complicated relationship with the wandering hero.
Chapter masters debated his nature in private councils.
Was he a blessed warrior, touched by the Emperor's light? A Xenos infiltrator playing a deep game? A demon of unprecedented subtlety? Or simply a man from another place, fighting by different rules, aligned with humanity through coincidence rather than doctrine? The Ultramarines, remembering Captain Leonie's report, tended toward cautious respect. The Black Templars declared him anathema, a false idol leading the faithful astray. The Salamanders, hearing stories of his civilian rescues, quietly hoped to meet him someday. Each chapter interpreted the legend through their own lens, finding either threat or inspiration. The common people simply believed. In the underhives and factory districts, in the agricultural communes and mining stations, people told stories about the warrior who never abandoned them. When everything seemed darkest, when chaos pressed close and the Imperium's protection failed, sometimes a figure in red would appear.
Sometimes he saved everyone. Sometimes he died drunk.
But he tried, and trying was more than most heroes managed. Children played games pretending to be the Red Warrior, fighting imaginary demons with stick weapons. Parents told the stories as bedtime tales, legends of defiance, when the Imperium's approved tales of martyrdom seemed too grim. Preachers condemned the stories as heresy even as their congregations whispered them in alcoves and shadows.
Zagreus knew about none of this.
He did not pay attention to his reputation, did not cultivate followers, did not care about legacy. He focused on the immediate, this battle, this life to save, this enemy to stop. The future was uncertain, the past unchangeable. Only the present moment mattered, only the next swing of his blade, the next dash toward danger.
He still had not found a way home.
The warp remained hostile, chaos still hunted him, and Olympus felt farther away with each passing year. Sometimes, in rare quiet moments between crises, he wondered if he would ever see the House of Hades again, ever argue with his father or joke with Thanatos, or feel his mother's embrace. Then someone would scream for help, and the wondering would stop. There was always another fight, another crisis, another impossible situation that needed someone foolish enough to try anyway.
5 years became 10, became 20. Zagreus stopped counting.
Time moved strangely for immortals, battles blurring together, resurrections becoming routine. He died 1,000 more times in this galaxy, each death teaching him more about chaos, about the Imperium, about the countless species fighting for survival in a universe designed to crush them. He learned Gothic fluently, then learned the dialects. He mastered the tactics of Space Marine combat and guard doctrine. He studied demon manifestation patterns and warp corruption vectors. Not because he planned to stay, but because every tool helped him help others. And helping others was all that mattered. The galaxy remained grim. The darkness did not retreat. Chaos did not weaken because one warrior refused to give up.
Zagreus understood there.
He was not naive enough to think one person could fix a galaxy drowning in 10,000 years of accumulated trauma.
But he could save the people in front of him.
He could fight the demons in this district. He could buy time for this evacuation, hold this line, guard this convoy. Small actions in an infinite war, drops of hope in an ocean of despair.
And sometimes drops became ripples. Ripples became waves.
The people he saved went on to save others. The soldiers who fought beside him remembered that courage was possible. The children who heard his stories grew up believing defiance was not heresy. Zagreus remained what he had always been, the son of Hades who kept getting back up,
The prince who refused to stay dead.
the god who would not kneel. He wandered the dark galaxy, laughing at death, fighting for those who could not fight, dying when necessary, returning when possible. The Imperium called him myth. Chaos cursed his name.
The common people prayed for his arrival.
And Zagreus simply continued, one battle at a time, one life at a time, one defiant laugh at a time.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there was only war.
But in the red shadow of a laughing warrior, there was also hope. And hope, against all doctrine and reason, refused to die.